Hello and welcome to BioFutures. Today we are joined by Veronica Ranner. Hello Veronica. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
It's great to be joining you. I'm thinking back, now it was quite a while ago, but we met at BioSalon before the pandemic, didn't we? In that wonderful Futera house on the top of St. Martin's.
That's a while ago.
So it's a shame that we're not in such a spectacular setting today, but I'm very excited to speak with you today about your extraordinary work. You're joining us from Singapore, and I thought for those people that are not familiar with your work, it might be nice if you started off by just telling us a bit about how did you get involved in the field? What drew you to it, and what were you doing before?
So originally I started out quite traditionally in the design field as an industrial designer, and my prior to that was a bit more craft-based and more in the traditional fine arts, and I said also like in ancient craft. Then I joined industrial design, not quite entirely sure anymore exactly why, but it seemed to me like an ideal field to kind of combine the different interests and also flesh out something that is a little bit more unique to my own interests. That seems like a more general field where I could shape my own path a little bit more succinctly over time rather than joining something too pre-configured. And yeah, so already back then I took an interest in biodegradable materials, actually, looking back. So I think my first concept with biomaterials was around like 2005 or something like that. But back then it was a concept. I thought it was very interesting and something that we have got to look into further. But back then, obviously, it was in a conceptual stage. I had no sort of clue how I will be able to bring those things, those materiality, not really of interest back then in industrial design, and was seen as a little bit of a lofty idea. Why would this go ever into industrial scale and so on and so on? But obviously, this is something where I felt has great potential. And then I parked the idea for quite a number of years because I was just not the right kind of environment to nourish and further those ideas. I got initially quite interested in biomedical product development. That is something that I came across when doing internship with Frog Design back then in Germany. So great company. I've learned a lot. And yeah, so that really took my interest. The complexity, the research component, also different time scale designing is something that I thought was very interesting. At the time, my impression was designing has got to be very fast, and the turnover time for design to production was getting faster and faster, and all at the same time. That didn't seem to be the case in biomedical product development, because the time from conception to ideation, conception, designing and fabrication until production, it can take up to 10 years sometimes, depending on the complexity of the product. That's something that I thought was really quite an interesting way of working, because the aesthetics and the shape and the form of the object and the product becoming less so of primary focus, but more the whole configuration in context, and also a good deal of forecasting if you want. Because if you needed something that is still cutting edge about 5, 6 to 10 years in advance, you have got to really do some good contextual research to make sure you can justify an investment good, which these products are very pricey at times. And also development and so on and so on. It kind of went on like this, so I got hooked enough for a short while in this not existing course anymore, the Design Interactions course at the RCA, which was this little niche course that existed for about like a decade. And I didn't really know much about the course, to be honest, when I joined it, which a lot of my classmates were quite surprised about because it was already quite famous back then. But in Germany, university professors are not necessarily extremely famous. It's not such a phenomenon, so we don't really have that. So I was actually joining more because of the student work. I thought the student work was interesting. I have never seen anything quite like it. Yeah, so this was the change from like the more traditional industrial oriented design, where the designer is also not connected to the outcome so directly, to a shift. I mean, I wasn't that quite interested in author design as such, but obviously in the UK that was a bit of a, it was more recognized, and there was an opportunity to try something along the lines. So it was quite a bit of a break from the German way of designing, going then to the UK, where I got quite it challenged my understanding of design quite a bit, because process was faster, often messier, but at the same time more liberating and creative, more daring, less obsessed with perfection. And all these things were very liberating. And because of the speed and the experimental nature during that time, I figured I was forced to really fall back to my genuine interests. There was no seeking for perfection and then aligning with what's really surrounding you, or what you feel like might support your career path in the best possible way. You really have got to go, when it's fast and experimental, with what drives you. That was very interesting to me, that process. And yeah, it made me really think about what it is exactly I find interesting about biomedical product development, about supply chains, about manufacturing, about the so-called user experience, although I don't really like using that term. I'm teaching it now, but the term user is a bit complicated, and yeah. But let's stick with UX. Everybody, I think, knows what it means, more or less, it can mean. And yeah, so during that time, I started reaching out, and we were encouraged to follow our interests, quite unapologetic. And I think that helped big times, because we were allowed to do wacky experiments. We were allowed to fail. And that was very encouraging. And so I took quite a few leaps in different directions, and was encouraged to hold that tension also. If it does not make sense for quite some time, it was all right, it was okay. And I think that really helped, that way of thinking and working. I hopefully maintained that over the years. Although there are significant updates, I'm not necessarily working in quite the same ways anymore. But at least the stance and the attitude, I think, is something I had hoped to maintain a bit and carry over in more recent updates. Yeah, not quite sure if that made sense.
That makes sense, because when I think to your work, I think of work that is very much, I mean, although all biodesign, biomaterials, biofabrication is at the interface, but it's very clear to me that yours is not at the interface of just 2 fields or 3 fields. It is deeply systemic. And having this more traditional background, it feels to me that you've got this compare and contrast. You can see that you've got 2 qualitatively different ways of working, and you've absolutely immersed yourself in this new way of working. This, well, I say new, it's the old way, isn't it? I mean, effectively, we're re-embracing traditional ways of working, in that we're working with nature. But and the other thing that really sort of stands out is that as a researcher, you have the same quality that a lot of the other radical thinkers have, in that you've worked across fields and you've also worked across regions. So you've been quite a nomad. in your life to date compared to the average man and woman on the street. How do you find that working across the different cultures has shaped your thinking about this field and about your approach to your work?
That's a really good question. I specifically reflected on that since I'm now 1.5 years here in Singapore. And I begin to reflect the sort of input and the changes that my observations and findings during that time. It took a bit of time until this can really sort of sink in and start shaping and changing the ways and how I'm going to integrate that into my previous practice. Obviously, it's been a whirlwind time here, settling in, starting teaching, getting to know everyone and the environment. So yeah, but I think what it really be able to distance yourself sometimes, I guess, and understand that changing perspective is something that can be actively brought into being, and it's actually something that can be trained and learned, and hopefully also conveyed to others as a way of applying that to your own work. So changing perspective is not just here's a new concept and you're still doing it in the same way. You have to actively take a stand back and trying to understand the other perspective better. It's very hard sometimes, especially let's say my German is not always helping, you see. Okay, I'm not 100% German as such anymore because of 11 years in the UK, but I remember very vividly the first 2 years were full of misunderstanding. You know, Germans are quite direct, we're often considered quite rude and so on and so on. That in the UK, after about two to 3 years, I began to understand how coded the language is. And as things as they are said they don't really mean what has been said, and so on and so on. And I feel like it's almost a bit of a repetition of the same kind of process as has happened when I came to Singapore. Although I felt like quite prepared for those things, and although I've also lived for a short while in the US and had some lesser so that type of effect, but it wasn't there long enough to really understand to what degree. You know, in the beginning it looks as if you're quite at the same level, but then the longer time goes, you realize that the differences are quite significant. So yeah, in Singapore I have noticed, thankfully, a lot more similarity than I thought. So there's a lot more resonance, and I think similarities than I initially assumed. And other aspects is just quite different and refreshing and interesting. And those changes and different, I really like to pick up more and also integrate those views more into my work, and also see not just take and integrating it into my work, but also see how genuine collaboration can result from that. That also means that I have to change.
I think, you know, what I notice about your work, because I often have a degree of frustration with the sort of technocratic focus of all conversations future. When we pick up the popular press and media, if it's shiny, if it's made of metal or glass, it tends to get a lot more attention than this whole field, this messy, this emergent field. And I think that's because the former appears on the surface of it to offer very simplistic solutions. It's the back of the envelope, and it, so say, is a golden bullet typically to a problem, whereas this field is still being defined. It's not yet understood, and I think every practitioner of note, every researcher of note very much understands that. And I've looked at a number of your projects, and I've found them to be, if you like, the holding up of the hand to some of the more ridiculous of these technocratic projects. So I think, for example, I saw this array of incubators for babies that looked like some sort of factory production line. It was all metal or glass, it was cold, it was sterile, there was nothing remotely biological about it. It completely ignored really everything we know about how the fetus develops and so forth. Whereas your work is, it's not just innately biological, but it feels that yours is that sense that there is this complexity to it, and there is a much more a softer side. There is a side that is not offering up simple solutions, but that is very sophisticated. Of the works that you've done so far, which of them do you feel challenge that sort of simplistic technocratic approach the most?
It's a really good question. I thought about that too. I mean, there are these two projects that I think have gained most popularity, also the ones I'm also showing mostly on the website. Well, a lot more projects I've done, but I'm not showing all of them. The one you're referring to, biophilia survival tissue, the sort of incubator, is actually one that I feel is perhaps more critical. The one with the silken heart, the organ crafting, also a critical project, but I guess in many ways it is more popular. It's also smaller, easier to ship, and less of a touchy subject, like than with. Oh, hang on. Here we go. I have a bit of a delay. Are we good?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
I think survival tissue, the premature born baby incubator.
Yeah.
Slightly misunderstood, potentially not necessarily, I think, because people do not like to misunderstand it, but it's a very difficult one to portray. I'm not 100% sure if my photographs also worked to the extent I wanted. It was really a zero budget project. It was had very little budget for this project. A lot of people helped out of goodwill because they liked the idea. They thought it was a fantastic project, and it really helped me. I was a student back then, and I didn't have any money at all. And it was really done in a really hasty and stressful manner. But also, I didn't really want to show a child either. So that's why I kind of had that focus was actually more on the parents. And many decisions to be made. And even like showing a supposedly heterosexual couple was something that I wasn't quite sure of. Should I not also show maybe like more diversity in that regard? But you have to make some decisions, and you go with sort of what's available as well at that time with very little budget. And these were the actors that were willing to kind of work with me at the given time window, and so on and so on. And lots of decisions come into it. But I think as a subject as such, talking about premature birth is still a touchy subject. I've witnessed already during my taboo associated with it. But the whole idea of assisted reproductive technologies is a very a lot of secrecy still around it. So in the last couple of years, I've seen some great developments, more openness, maybe also thanks to social media. People are opening up and do not hide away anymore, and really talk about physical health, dysfunctional bodies, disability, or also things like infertility or things like that. They really open up now. But when I started that project, and I have to say, human-assisted reproductive sciences is something that already interested me for my first degree in Germany. But I ditched the idea very last minute and opted for a different project because I felt if I'm doing that in Germany, I would be probably associated with what women do. It was a very strategic decision not to pick up on that field earlier on, because I didn't feel like I have the critical tools quite yet to address it. It would have been a very positivist project. Oh, this is going to be good for the baby, this is going to be good for the mother, and you know what I mean? And I would have been associated, I think, like packed conveniently and pushed into that and I didn't want that. So I also wanted to really think about, what does femininity mean, really? What does that mean in relation to birth? Was the role of women, if reproductive rights are being technologized, access is given or by so-called third parties, and so on and so on. There's a lot of things. The more you think about it, is actually the more complicated and complex it gets. The rights of the children that are being placed in that situation without their consent, there's a lot of things to unravel. Yeah. The dilemma is actually a key thing I like to materialize in many ways. I think I haven't really talked about that so explicitly before, but I guess a dilemma. What is a dilemma? None of the decisions you have available are obviously better than the other. You have choices at hand and you don't know quite which one you should be picking. Neither of them is going to be perfect. So obviously you're going to pick the one that may help no matter the outcome. So with any of these technologies, those premature born incubators that save the children at a very young age, children may not fully properly develop. They may not have, may have developmental issues, brain development problems, cognitive issues later on. There's a lot of concerns tied to the child's development. But then here's the question: if you would be in that situation, wouldn't you also pick any option available? And I guess about design, you're opening some sort of Pandora's box here. You create a solution, supposed solution, and yet you create so many more problems at the time. And that is, I find, very fascinating. That in itself, I find extremely fascinating. I'm not saying it's necessarily a good thing, but materializing those moments of acceptance, also of desensitization to technology. I mean, we're working towards the artificial womb, right? That is the development that's happening. And okay, so we have on the one hand the artificial womb, right? And on the other hand, there is, for example, artificial insemination, IVF technologies and things like that, where the conception of a child is happening already outside of the body in a petri dish, and here you have a potential incubator also already outside of the woman's body. And then there's this stretch in between of development. Obviously, if you jump from what we have right now, the artificial womb, there's going to be a lot of outcry. We've had that before, where experiments had to be closed, they had to be cut short because people felt so at unease about it. And then I looked at the science and technology studies and examples from the past where the same was the case when it came to organ transplantation. You know, when the first liver transplant was communicated, people were outraged about it and disgusted, and they said people walk around with corpse parts, and this is unholy, ungodly, and so on and so on. The attitude has changed really in that regard. People say, of course, if you get it, you're so lucky. You get a second chance at life. And so I guess my question was, what has changed between then and now? So a lot of chipping away, a lot of small persuasion, a lot of desensitization and things like that, easing you into the idea that's actually okay. It's okay, I can do it. It has been normalized. And that normalization visualization process I also thought was very interesting. If there is a point, I'm presenting you with an opportunity where you cannot say no because it's just too tempting and just too good to say no. Will you still say no?
Yeah.
So an incubator idea, because it's going to be good for the baby, you know, the child is going to get that development push because it's going to be on real skin, which will benefit the child's cognitive and physical development. It's not going to be your body because, you know, you're full of germs, but it's going to be replicated in the womb, and it's going to be sterile. The child can grow until it's strong enough to be able to withstand any germs, microbes, and whatnot. Yeah. So, yeah, but you have got to accept the fact that there's going to be some strange tissue fabrication, that duplicate out there from you. That's the small price of awkwardness and strangeness to pay. And what would happen with that thing after? No. So lots of interesting things to consider. Obviously, there are some design flaws in the thing. Yeah, I mean, that was also conscious choice. For example, the incubator designs that I have heavily criticized in the past, the plastic boxes in the hospitals. Usually, it's the nurses who know best how they should be improved and could be improved. They have made them all soft with all those little stuffings and you know, giving them the confined space and so on and so on, and they put fabric on top of it to make it dark. So actually, if it was an actual designed piece, which it is not, it is an actual glass blown piece, a hand blown glass piece this size, it would have to be dark, but it's not. That was something that I didn't do.
I think it's such an important project because it feels, you know, like I think all complex thinkers are drawn to these messy problems because they are inherently the most interesting, and they are obviously among the foremost that need exploration. And this, as you say, is one of the stickiest. It feels that we are in a time now where effectively sort of birthrights have been, in a sense, taken away from some communities, and historically over time through economic pressures. And we've now obviously got the fact that a lot of data is showing that infertility is becoming prevalent in areas where certain pollutants are very abundant. And it feels in some ways like, in the worst case scenario, we could be on this sort of highway to a nightmare sci-fi scenario where, you know, the majority of people are in effect economically excluded from having a decent chance at having a family. And then there are potentially this small number of people that, through their extreme wealth, the matter that we've seen the wealth gap, the social mobility gaps grow worldwide, have the chance to reproduce. And your project feels as if it's, again, it's a challenge to this because it's another approach. It's a very different approach. It's giving agency to a different community. The economics would be very different, just as the ethics are very different. And it strikes me, you know, that's the beauty in it. And it doesn't actually matter if this is just a prototype, because actually it's at the level of ethics and of philosophy and of the questions of who should have what rights, and, you know, how should we actually, if you like, design policy around the future of fertility. So I think that is the beauty in the project.
I mean, don't get me wrong, there are issues with the project too, yeah. Things that I have identified along the go already within the research. I knew this is going to be a technocratic design suggestion, but I guess I feel that has been justified because I am not endorsing it. It is not an endorsement of the technology at all, actually, when you think about it. But that is a difficult one because I am showing it, yet at the same time I'm distancing myself, and that is a very difficult thing to achieve. I'm not sure how, if that's not always successful. Sometimes those things can utterly fail very easily. So yeah, it got a lot of friction and feedback, critique for it too. People have written me angry emails. Oh, what an unpricely project it is, and so on and so on. And yeah, that might be true, but I have not come up with that technology. It's not my idea. I'm not responsible for it just because I'm interested in talking about it. So yeah, I think that's something that I also figured. That's why I feel like it's still important to do projects like that, because people need to understand, just because I'm talking about something, it doesn't mean I'm endorsing it. It doesn't mean I am having an opinion about it as such. There's a difference between defending an opinion or talking just about a subject matter. And I felt this is something that I'm not defending it. This is not my opinion. It's just this field exists. Technologies like that exist. It is interesting and they're problematic, so it would be good to talk about it maybe. And that kind of distance is something that needs to be trained a bit more again, I find. And there are many other traditions of criticality, criticism, and speculative fiction that are already doing that in other fields and in other forms and other formats. I'm not saying that materialized critique through object, I mean, that's a little bit outdated in itself by now, yeah, is the only way forward, but it also exists. So, and I think in this format and in this area, specifically because it's such a visceral area, it's to do with matter and form and tactility, I think that's where I feel like it's still justified to kind of go with the object, with an object-based approach.
I always think it's actually quite good if you get quite a lot of criticism, because when you think, I mean, I always think of the sort of the founding fathers of the theory of evolution as being the sort of the founding fathers of this field, in that they obviously brought forth the idea that nature was emergent and that things evolve and can therefore change. And as I look to your studio behind you, I see these fabulous artifacts on the wall, and you gave me a little virtual tour earlier, so I could see all your kit and everything going on there. And it does feel a little bit like, you know, Darwin's update on his studio. And of course, he had a massive amount of criticism. He too would have had angry letters, among other things, by those that were horrified at the possibility that the creationist vision was flawed. And he too had this very sort of precarious process, in a sense, of bringing his work forward, because he obviously, at that time, he didn't have any sort of formal vessels. He was self-directing his research. He was sort of doing it in some respects in a sort of underground fashion, in that the community knew that what they were working on was not very popular among most people. And I sort of look at this whole community now, and I see these parallels, and that I see many people are working with quite contentious ideas, whether or not, as you say, they agree with them or not. They're looking at the reality here and thinking, well, of the options, might this be a possibility? Even if there are no panaceas, as you say, there's no sort of ideal here. There is the fact that funding is difficult, because this is not applied science, because we don't yet have all of the sort of the rules defined. So this is not an extractive process where you're merely just taking what's been established and then turning it into a production process. This is blue sky thinking. And a lot of the characters in this field, they are, as yourself, you're a transdisciplinary artist and designer and researcher. And so you can't just drop you into a box. You can't just drop anyone who is featured in this entire series or the previous series into a box. And for a lot of people, that's pretty mind-blowing, because they'd like us to be in boxes. How do you find that you deal with some of the sort of the challenges of working in this arena, beyond the fact that, you know, some of the ideas you explore are not always terribly popular?
Mm, I guess, okay, first of all, it helps if you do not care too much. That is, if you remain a little bit unbothered to a certain degree, at least, which is hard, you know. We're all human in the end of the day. Sometimes it gets you, obviously, and you want to, you know, want to be liked and things like that. But that's most times I actually do not mind. If something really interests me, I will plow through, and that's what interests me no matter what. And then I will pursue the thing and just stick with it. Depends on how to what degree I'm interested in. You see, like the work with silk, for example, that keeps me fascinated for already quite a while, for far too long. But then it's just a subject area that just keeps on giving and giving and giving. I mean, the whole thing about silk and reverse engineered silkworms is something I started researching in 9, and I'm still working with a subject and trying to kind of develop new grant proposals and so on to kind of become bigger. I have a lot of ideas on the back burner. I'd say it always helps if you have if you're flexible in the way you present yourself. You see, my latest work around polyphonic futures, the idea of transdisciplinary design science society collaboration, which is not radically new as such, but I believe the way I'm doing it adds a little twist and difference and inject perhaps some much needed freshness. At least I like to think so. It's the same thing with tissue engineering. When I started looking at with a womb, it's been already a technology that's been around. It's already been accepted. You know, nobody would question the idea anymore of growing organs at the time. It wasn't radical as such anymore. But that's what I figured. I feel like it was pushed a little bit too quickly into acceptance, and it wasn't dealt with critically and enough, and it wasn't problematized to the extent I would like to have seen. That's why I kind of almost picked up a topic that was already not of interest anymore to most people. People are like, oh, this is synthetic biology, or you have these you know, now then quickly, shortly after CRISPR, Cas9, and so on and so on. But I felt like, no, this is a subject area that I feel like needs revisiting now, unraveling, and presented anew in a way. And I guess it's the same thing with collaboration. Everybody likes to say they're doing it, and but do you actually do it? Do you do interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary? Do you actually go out beyond even your own discipline? Do you actually talk to people that are not even of your same social status? Are you going outside of your own fields and challenge your own boundaries? Yeah? Do you actually listen to people that are not as educated as you? And do you actually listen and not just extract? Yeah. So this that I find fascinating. It's not just going there and patting yourself on the shoulder and saying, oh, I'm such an open-minded person. Look at me, the transdisciplinary designer I am. I go out and listen to the people on the street. It's not like that. I mean, that's what I'm saying. Shifting perspective actually means really trying to understand and really trying to show respect and understanding, and trying to meet people at eye level no matter where you go. So I guess, and that is again, it's a difficult one. It's to be very subtle. It needs to be practiced. Vocabulary has to be established. Ways of working, tact. Not all of those things are necessarily and immediately yielding price tag. It's going to benefit, or it's going to benefit our research project. It doesn't work that way. So sometimes it takes a bit convincing and persuasion. That's why I feel like I can play and can say.
I can totally relate to what you're saying, because within my primary field of academic research, looking at biomimicry of the biochemistries, the relationships of systems of fire adapted and evolved species, and what we might learn from that, I find that the arena of fire science, and particularly as applies to the built environment, is highly segregated. Sorry. And there are individuals that are, sorry. You just speak for a bit.
Yeah, I think I'm starting. Yeah, I've been there. I've had like a terrible cough for quite a long time. People who know me. So I guess we have to wait for a moment. I'll have to awkwardly speak into the void. I'll have to say, never done this before, so you can all witness the awkwardness.
Apologies for that.
There we go.
Yeah, it's they're speaking in different languages, they have different lenses, and this is hugely problematic, because it's only when you actually look through the different lenses and you actually listen to the different communities, to the engineers, to the scientists, to the folklore and the lore of fire science, that you actually start to get to a point at which you've got a systemic approach. And until that point, you've just got all of these arguing, clashing communities at a time when we desperately need to develop new solutions. And it's really hard. And I think one of the things that makes it hardest is the fact that many of those communities that hold their own position don't want to relinquish it, because that is their sort of their professional status is nested in that tradition. So to actually revisit and actually acknowledge, well, hang on a minute, there's an error here, or there is a problem here, and we can only actually address it if we bring in this sorry, I'm in quite a mess. We bring in this idea from over here that might actually be quite contradictory to the lens that we had before. And it's also, that area is very male dominated, very male dominated. So you sort of find that you're going in as the outsider, totally conscious of the fact that you're the outsider, and that what you're saying is not necessarily always going to be very popular, but that it does need to be said, and that you don't necessarily have the answers, but what you can do is, through this process you're speaking to, actually spotlight where the problems are. And you can prove that because you can sort of compare, contrast, you can do analyses, you can show the system in its complexity. So it's a critical process. Tell me more about Polyphonic Futures.
So it's a project I've started also quite a while ago. I initially, not quite sure if I've told you about this, but I've been in touch with a laboratory at Tufts University in Boston for a number of years. Sorry, I'm coughing.
Apologies to the people viewing. We're pushing through.
all for you guys. So we've been in touch for a number of years. Actually, now first we were in touch, I think 2011 or 12, and in 2011 actually, and Fiorenzo and I got in touch with each other, and I was visiting the lab first time in 2012. He invited me over for giving a talk there, and give lectures and so on, and we started informally exchanging. Back then the lab was still sort of quite open, everybody could just march in, the technology was not yet so matured, patents were not quite issued yet, and so on and so on, and it wasn't high security as it is now. And yeah, shortly after I started the PhD, and then managed after a while and with some convincing to be allowed to go there as a visiting scientist for research exchange as part of my ongoing work. So I've spent in total 4 months in the lab, and there's been a very generous of Firenze Omeneto to allow me to be there this long without funds and consumables and things like that. I was really able to play and move freely, speak to everyone. It was mostly in the conversations with the scientists that I figured I was quite keen initially to get my hands on the material, you know, the usual, the product designer, start making an object and so on and so on. And I have made, I've worked with the material and made a series of small objects, but what I realized, and that's something that came a little bit as a surprise to me, that the conversations with the scientists were far more interesting than the making. Often those times when they demonstrated something to me and I was following through with those laborious steps, you know, processing the silk from the cocoon into like a liquid shape in the reverse engineered form can take, if you're fast, at least untrained person as I was, and you're fast, it's going to take you 4 or 5 days. The more experienced people are possibly faster if they don't sleep much and so on. So they can achieve it faster. But it takes a couple of days, and there's a lot of processing involved. You have a time to chat to people in a very informal manner. And yeah, so people talk me through how, I always ask what got you interested in that material, because it's a very fascinating material. It changes, shape changes according to hygroscopic changes in the air pressure. The computing of the material is actually happening due to environmental factors in combination with human input and technology. So it doesn't work in isolation either or. It's this kind of combination of those environmental factors and also the material quality, where a bit like wine, you know, depending on soil conditions, and so ingredients and quality and so on makes the perfect wine, or it makes the perfect body interface later on. That's quite an interesting one. So it kind of really got me thinking about a sort of different kind of material-induced computing, actually. Biodigital body interfaces and computing. So I started configuring concepts and how they would differ from the point of origin, animal side product, to supply chain, manufacturing, processing, point of delivery, and so on, integration and dissolving, and would be the remaining out. And in the end of the design is actually transient. It's not, there's no object anymore. What you design is the behavior of people. So without a trace, that's an interesting one. So and I figured that's something that got me very interested. I'm still working along that line, and designing for and with transience, with that ephemerality. What is design when the object vanishes entirely? Could say, yes, of course, you've designed the thing, you configured, but that's what an engineer can do too. What's the design part? What's the difference here? So then I started talking about with the scientists who actually shape the technology. They define right now, they have defined about a decade ago, and they still do that right now, the possibility frame of what's possible. The more you think about it, actually, figured they are kind of cartographing the possibilities of human behavior right now as a side effect without even realizing they're doing that. Because the step from the action of working with a material to its impact and consequence later on is too abstract. They often complained about the fact, some of them actually, the surprisingly younger ones, they were very aware that this is happening. They said this, they figured these are conversations that should happen. They should be done. It wasn't really taking place. It's also, when you think about it, there's a pipeline of production in any kind of lab, in any kind of R&D environment. You have got to achieve your own set of goals. You have funding bodies, you have bosses to please, you have line managers and so on. Unfortunately, you also have rent to pay. You know, there's lots of things that prevent you or everyone, in effect, from doing the right thing. It's not that people are as such malicious, lazy, or complacent. I don't believe that at all. I actually believe most people, call me idealist, but I believe most people essentially have a good moral compass and they know what they would like to do, but then, you know, life comes in the way, right? And we can't be always the way you would like to be. Yeah? And I figured there's a gap here. What if we have a chance to kind of offer some pockets for conversations for the impossible, also in environments like that, high-paced, confidential environments. But you can't be too critical either if you cannot discredit your boss or bring them into, give them bad reputation and so on. Is that you have got to be a bit careful here, because not everybody sees criticality or criticism as the positive thing it should be and as constructive as it can be. You know, it wasn't Kowal who always said, if you criticize somebody, do it with humor or they kill you, right? So I think there's some kind of difficulty here in allow or like enable people to voice and freely without compromising their job. Perhaps even the professionalism, some ideas are simply just wacky, and you may want to talk about it over a glass of wine, but you wouldn't say that, right? So we have those different facades and level of professionalism that need to be taken into account too. But sometimes it is exactly those ideas that yield potential. Somebody else might hear them and say, hang on, there is something in here. We should really talk and develop that further. So, okay, I felt like acting as a proxy coming in as a designer. That's a role that I'm quite familiar with in many ways, you know, like especially as industrial designer, I find you're being a bit the jack of all trades. Now you're coming here, you're speaking to suppliers, manufacturers, you're speaking to marketing, funding bodies, then colleagues, you know, craftspeople, tradespeople, whatnot, color and trim, whatever. You have so many people you have to deal with to kind of collectively configure a design. That's why I kind of like to start talking about design configuration, because you're not doing this on your own. Yeah, kind of push and pull with a team, needed together, and then in the end is a result of collective effort. Having a little bit more say because I'm the designer, but that's the kind of role we're in. But with Polyphonic Futures, I thought I was allowed access to that lab, okay? And part of me felt, okay, yeah, I can come up with a great, fantastic idea. It's gonna get me lots of press and so on and so on. I'm gonna have, because of that exclusivity I have been given, right? And but is that the most interesting finding I have there? And I felt like, no, actually, I realized it's a bit like, you know, laboratory life style. Studying the context is actually more interesting, and it made me reflect about my own privilege and my own position as a designer through connections and access, that I can go there and have those conversations, and it shouldn't be that way. So in many ways, I try to pierce those walls a little, make them permeable, but in a way that the lab doesn't feel it's leaking. Yeah, because that would make them very uncomfortable, and also, strictly speaking, there are IP issues. You know, you can get into serious trouble if you're not doing this properly. Yeah. So yeah, that was. It's a bit of a dance. It's basically, I feel like it's quite a dance. So you have to make sure everybody's still dancing with you, and enjoying the dance, ideally. And you're gonna change dance partners around and see what's coming out of those exchanges, right? So the polyphony is the idea that I would circulate that knowledge to very disparate groups of people that would otherwise have any access to a lab or to that information, or having even the time and capacity to study what this material can do for X number of months. Who has that? You work in industry or in a high pressure job, nobody has that time to sit down and really understand. You need somebody to break for you in simple terms. Then you can have a conversation about that. And that's where I feel like I come into play, because I believe I have broken it down into formats of different degrees of complexity depending on who's joining, and while still maintaining correct factuality. It's very difficult because I started with expert formats, experts in their own rights, other artists, designers, creative technologists, engineers, people who are quite tech savvy and open-minded, educated, whatnot, right? These people are easy to deal with, they soak everything in, they do know some of the jargon, and so on and so on. That's the very easy format. And then collectively speculate, really. That was the idea. I've developed various formats where we can come together, we have a good atmosphere, we have a good laugh. We spend enough time together to enjoy ourselves too, and have a relaxing atmosphere, really important. And yeah, and work with material translations that I developed, so people have the same kind of material experience than I had in the lab, just in a safe manner. Because the materials are sort of not, they are expensive, right? They are, some of them are quite, I wouldn't say toxic, but they are not easy to deal with. Well, yeah, some of them are actually quite toxic or a bit dangerous in wrong dosage. Too pricey, inaccessible. There's a point why these things are done in a lab, okay? It's not done to exclude people, it's just because it's required. So I developed like representation materials that are very interesting. Now I see these days people are hailing these things as bioplastic and so on. And you see all those cookbooks, and actually I've done that many years ago, but I've never considered that a real viable product, because those materials, they will disintegrate very quickly. To me, they are more representations, they're props, and they are mostly appealing to in a sort of phenomenological manner. Difficult one. They are appealing to the senses, and you don't necessarily need to convey everything in a prescriptive manner on a textual format. Not to say people wouldn't understand otherwise, but I feel there's a different kind of quality if you can follow through with something yourself, in your own idiosyncratic manner, in your own way, without me telling you directly, because that is where the sort of authoritative figure of me as a designer would kind of interfere certain things, and basically say, off you go and play and do your own thing. And that's, I felt like when I realized the quality of the ideas really changed. Because it's not just, okay, here is me, I'm teaching you the ways, here's a PowerPoint, here are slides. Yes, still fall back into that format when I'm kind of, when I have to, because the teaching material in a material-led manner is very time intensive in preparation. But for those workshops, I've really made the custom experiences with people. Some workshops were a week long, which was fantastic. Some of them were a weekend, full day, half day. I have like a 6 hour, 4 hour, and even a 1 hour format. And that the last one was the most difficult one, because you really have to, it's an outline drawing if you want, right? It's not like it's not going to be like a Rembrandt. It's going to be like an outline, very, very sketchy and very basic. And I figured through my research feedback, a certain degree of complexity has to be maintained, otherwise the engagement is becoming too superficial and too stereotypical also. That's when people fall to cyborgs and things like that, when we talk about body interfaces. When you don't provide enough detail, that's what happens. People fall back into the stereotypical thinking. That's what
I'm going to have 2 more questions. There are lots and lots of questions I'd love to ask you, but I'm conscious of time, and so we've definitely got to schedule another session when I'm not dying of a virus under attack from pathogens, and yeah, when we can find a moment. But there are 2 questions that I ask everybody in this series, and the first one I think you're definitely going to have a very, very compelling answer to, because I can see that you can see lots of the problems that we face, particularly with the issue of dealing with criticism. How do you create those spaces and places where you investigate, you examine, and you do so in a way that is going to illuminate the problems, but without breaking down the relationships? And well, I'm sure the second one you're going to come forwards with something very, very interesting. But the first question is, if you could have just one wish, any wish at all, for your own research project, for the domain, you know, for biofields as an entity.
Oh, you've been now hear the question because you were breaking off. So you,
oh, right. I'll repeat that. So, if you could have just one wish come true, for either your future research, for the biofields, or for how they apply to society, what would it be and why?
One wish.
Oh,
that's a really. Oh, you got me. I'd like to inflict my wishes onto other people, to be honest. How should I put this? I'd rather speak for myself. I guess that's probably better. I'd like to, maybe not so much for the field of biodesign as such, but I'd like to. It would be great if people could consider the value of critical viewpoints a little bit more positively. And well, they do, and they. But friction a little bit more, a little bit more passionately, yeah, a little bit more positively, because I feel like it's actually a huge compliment when somebody criticizes you. I find they're taking the time. And they accept the kind of anger that you have, right? You basically you're inflicting anger in another person. They're okay with that, and they're putting up with it. Probably not always because they're good people, but because they are genuinely either interested in the subject area. I mean, it might be also just mean, but very, very rarely I find it. Very often I feel like this comes from a place of genuinely wanting to improve something, making a good point, or wanting to help and enrich the conversation. So I feel like if we could take the time for things like that before we always expect immediate glossy results and outcomes and embrace that messiness a little bit more in the process, that would be fantastic.
Brilliant. I'm just, my battery is starting to fail. So very, very quickly, it's overheating. Very quickly,
okay.
The year is 2050. How do you see these fields having developed? What are your visions for the sort of impact that they could have on society?
Like a prediction machine.
Yeah. Yeah, prediction machine. That's a great analogy.
Oracle. I find it very difficult because you see, a couple of years ago we weren't even thinking of a pandemic. 2015, I don't know, we're probably just as stupid as we are now, I guess, in many ways. I am not so necessarily so optimistic about the future. First of all, like people are very reluctant to change in general. I guess I'd much rather focus on right now and see how we can shift the path right now, so we can move iteratively towards 2050 without total catastrophe. That would be fantastic. I think it's actually a bit harmful to always talk about, oh, in the future I'm going to be like this and that. In the future everything's going to be better, because that absolves you in a way responsibility of having to deal with the messiness of right now. I mean, how many times have we talked about, 2020, 2030, and it sounded so futuristic, like in late 90s, right? You're like, wow, 2030, that sounds like it's very soon, it's around the corner, yeah? And do we have flying cars? No. We still cook on a stove, it's still gonna be like Latour, we have never been modern. We're still quite primitive creatures that have still the same primitive needs in many ways. We're still like physical bodies exposed to gravity. I actually believe that a little bit of a reality check, what's needed, and doing a bit of inventory of even technology, what is needed, and in the context, thinking more systemically, what are we doing, and is it actually benefiting our health, happiness, collective well-being, and is technology always the only way forward? I think that's something that would be great if we can progress socially a bit more, perhaps also through material-led investigations that induce perhaps such changes, maybe.
I think that sounds a great vision. I'm completely signed up with you there. I think a lot of the future visions are basically defaulting responsibility and not accepting that everything that we're doing right now is not just going to define what happens in the future, but in the very, very near future. And the implications are profound. It's been brilliant speaking with you. My only regret is that it's so short. We could just have a whole day. We could have a whole day of this. And that I'm in such a mess.
Sure. I mean, you've done so well. I thought you really have to stop, but you kind of.
I've tried to keep it going. Best of luck with all of your exciting projects. I can't wait to see what you're going to be bringing forth next, and we will definitely schedule something else. Thank you to you for your time, and thank you to everyone that has tuned in. We've had to reschedule Electric Skin because I was even more ill a couple of days ago than I am now, and completely incapable of hosting that session. So that will be the next session, and we'll be putting that online later this week. So for now, Veronica, thank you again, and goodbye to everybody else.
Bye-bye.